Thanks again to our previous panel for the discussion on legislative history and lobbying influence over alcohol-related issues. Now, as we shift towards conclusions, I want to welcome a new panel, three new panelists. First, Michael Bird, the former president of the American Public Health Association. Trip Jennings, we've seen you before, executive director of New Mexico In-Depth, and former Democratic State Senator Dee Dee Feldman, co-author of this report that we've been talking about from Common Cause New Mexico. Now, we just got done talking through the inner workings at the Roundhouse, how that's influenced legislative action on alcohol. And I want to zoom out now and kind of talk about why this issue is so important and how we can elevate the discussion that's been stagnant for decades, at least in terms of legislative progress. Let's start with what the average New Mexican might think about this. If I'm a guy at home with a drink in my hand watching this, why would I want to pay more for that drink? How can increasing alcohol taxes, Trip, benefit this whole state's society?
So as you may have talked on the first panel, I mean, New Mexico leads the nation. I just want to start out with this kind of like social determinants here, which is leads the nation in alcohol-related deaths. And it's not people dying on highways like DWI, it's chronic conditions, cirrhosis of the liver. You've got all some sort of data that shows that like even among 25 to 34 year olds, cirrhosis of the liver is one of the leading causes of death. This is related to alcohol. As far as the person who is sitting there thinking, why should I pay more? I want to say that our reporting at New Mexico In-Depth, what we did a big series on this, is not that alcohol in and of itself is bad. It's just the overuse maybe that happens, and that there are studies that have shown in other states that have increased the taxes that's shown that it actually reduces certain behaviors. And if you're someone who's, maybe someone who watches the state budget, who thinks about health spending over the next 20 to 30 years, because that is part of the conversation in any legislative body, Congress, New Mexico legislature, if you reduce kind of behaviors on the front end, sometimes you save money on the back end. And so, that's something that if I think about when I'm sitting there maybe having a beer on a Friday night, is I do think about that kind of stuff because I've been around the legislature for so long. Sure. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think there are ways that are impacted. Plus, there are personal stories that people have around this kind of stuff.
I understand that. And Michael, I want to go to you with a similar question to really kind of nail this down. How do we get everyone on the same page here, legislators, statewide leaders, and the public, to understand what the societal burdens of this chronic overuse that Trip talks about are?
Well, let me just say, in addition to being past president of the American Public Health Association, first American Indian, which itself is something that hasn't come easily. I also, and having spent time as a medical social worker with the Santa Fe Indian Hospital early in my career, dealing with a host of issues, including substance abuse that was impacting Native communities, and a personal experience. My family, our family, was significantly impacted by substance abuse. My father, as well as some other members of my family over the years, have been challenged by substance abuse, and my father actually died of cirrhosis, and the impact that had on me as a young man growing up, the impact it had on our immediate family was long-standing and devastating. I can just say, as a young man growing up, I didn't have a father. I didn't have a role model in terms of how to behave as a man, as a father, and because he wasn't in my life, and the role modeling I did receive was negative, and so I think that when you really look at this issue, you have to look at the families that are being impacted, because the family of origin is weakened when you have members of the family who are caught up in alcohol use and abuse, primarily abuse, and that has long-standing consequences, and it almost becomes, if without some intervention, the gift that keeps on giving. And so family of origin is undermined, and it manifests itself in a whole host of ways, including substance abuse by family members, and the host of other issues, DWIs, people being not being gainfully employed because they can't hold their jobs, and so it's this is not. Again, this is not just an esoteric issue. I know what it's like to grow up in that environment, and I would not wish this upon anyone.
Thank you for sharing that, Michael.
And you wonder how many stories there are out there that are like Michael's, and the hundreds of thousands of people in New Mexico who have been affected by alcohol abuse. I mean, you talked earlier about how much it's costing the state, and I think the estimate is that it costs $2.77 for every drink that the state must pay in Medicaid, in criminal justice, but it's nothing compared to the toll it takes on families, and the unraveling of the sort of social order that occurs as a result of that. And we're paying for that in so many ways in New Mexico, and I think the question now is, are we willing to put up with that? Or do we want to take some measures to address it? Because the measures that we're taking right now are that 75% of the people that have alcohol abuse disorder are not getting treatment. They're just scraping by, or they're having to go out of state, and the state isn't even paying for it.
Now, on that point about trying to find a solution, is there anything in the works that you're aware of in the legislature right now? To this point, on the legislature's website, nothing's been pre-filed, but do you know of anything that could be working?
Yes, I believe that they are going to introduce again a measure to increase the alcohol tax. Last year it was by 25 cents a drink, and I think that is essentially the same amount that they are going for this year. And that money would be put into an alcohol harms reduction fund that would specifically go to repairing the damages that alcohol is doing to families and to the human infrastructure of our state. And I think they estimated that would yield something like $250 million every year, which would be a real step forward.
I want to say too, related to this, which is right now that there's an alcohol excise tax, and the proceeds that the state takes in, half of the money goes to treatment and programs. The other half of that goes to the general fund, or the state's main checking account. So part of this move this year is also to make sure, I believe, that's what I'm hearing, that all the money goes to the treatment and programs, not to the general fund. Okay. So they're really trying to really be specific and dedicate this money to these treatment and programs, because that has shown that it helps.
Okay. Now, beyond taxes, journalist Ted Alcorn, his 7-part series that he wrote for you at New Mexico In Depth, he gave some recommendations, and one of those, they include raising taxes, obviously measuring alcohol sales, and lowering the legal standard for driving from 0.08 to 0.05. That happened in Utah, and they saw a 20% drop in fatal crashes. Given the failures of tax proposals to this point, are those types of changes too ambitious, or is that where the conversation needs to go?
This is going to be I want to say the context for this discussion in 2024. These are some things to, you were in the legislature for a while, so you can really maybe put a finer point on what I'm about to say, which is oftentimes to pass a major piece of legislation, it takes 6 or 7 years. That's one thing. I would say that there's going to be a lot of discussion around, this is an election year. Do we pass taxes in an election year? That's going to be really interesting. I think that there's going to be a lot of conversation about how local producers are treated? Versus out-of-state folks, and is that going to increase the chances for a tax? I've talked to a lobbyist who's representing some alcohol folks, and he thought that the tax would pass this year. It was not going to be maybe, how things work in the legislature is it's a negotiation. You start here with 25 cents and you negotiate, and where that tax will end up, who knows?
Last year it ended up at 1 cent.
Yeah, it was sort of striking to see how that happened. But those of us who've been around the legislature, I was not necessarily surprised or shocked.
Okay. Yeah, we talked to Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez in this first segment, and she said that there was some confusion about that, and she kind of attributed the watering down of that bill to that. But Michael, the reporting on this is clear, and as you mentioned, that New Mexico has a problem with alcohol, the nation-leading problem. More elected officials acknowledged that, even with that confusion, but the governor still vetoed the bill. Whether or not that was a good thing, as Antoinette Cedillo Lopez had said, to keep the conversation moving and hopefully get a bigger increase this year, is there something that you've seen that could indicate that why the governor hasn't been an advocate for this issue?
Well, I'll try and keep my response brief. We have the best in this nation today. We have the best government that money can buy, and when it really breaks down for me, what do we value? Do we value human life, or do we value the dollar? And my grandfather, who's long since passed on, once said to me, what this nation values is the God Almighty dollar. And we need to do the moral thing and the right thing. We need to take care of all people. We need to ensure that children are protected, that families are protected, and one way to do that is by acting. When you have the opportunity to take action and protect our people, all people in the state of New Mexico, what other course is there?
Thank you, Michael.
Well, the course that is being followed now is the path of least resistance. And the last time that the legislature increased the tax on alcohol was in 1993. That's a long time ago. And in it, you're asking what could be done now in place of an alcohol tax increase. Well, there are a lot of levers that the state uses when it comes to alcohol, and those are licenses, those are control of the hours that bars stay open. Those are the kinds of things. However, in the past couple of years, we have acted to loosen the distribution of alcohol, to allow home deliveries of alcohol, for example, to increase the Sunday sales. And all of those little things kind of add up, It doesn't seem like much, and everybody wants to help the small mom and pop local brewery, the microbrewery, which is a key to local economic economic self-determination in a way. But the chickens are coming home to roost now. And all of those little favorable giveaways that we've given in the past couple of decades are mounting up. And they're mounting up to 6 people dying of alcohol-related abuses every day in New Mexico. Now, I don't know whether that's a price we're willing to pay or not. We're certainly acting as if it is something that we are willing to pay for.
Can I add to that?
Briefly, 30 seconds.
Yeah, okay, so basically, the dollar stuff, I know you guys talked about this previous panel about the lobbying money and stuff like this. I will say that I think that the lobbyists are feeling the pressure. I really do. I think that the momentum on this thing is kind of incredible. I've been around the legislatures for 20-something years, and I've never seen something move this quickly, actually. I want to say that. So.
Well, I
Thank you,
think
Tripp.
one of the things that I've found that there are certain common sense solutions that even the lobbyists agree on. For example, that all of the money that is collected from alcohol taxes should go into programs that are addressing that problem.
I got to end it there, but thank you all. Tripp Jennings, Michael Bird, Dee Dee Feldman, thank you very much. And we do have a link to this report from Common Cause New Mexico, still under the influence. That's on our website. Thank you.